In the United States, Dr. Anthony Fauci is placing himself in quarantine. This after coming into contact with someone who tested positive for COVID-19 inside the White House. Fauci has tested negative and says the contact with the staffer was, quote, low risk. Now, he's one of the experts leading the response in the United States. 2 other members of the White House coronavirus task force are going into quarantine as well and have also tested positive. The identity of the White House employee has not been revealed, but on Friday, the press secretary to Vice President Mike Pence tested positive for the disease. This comes as the White House faces intense criticism for its handling of the pandemic. Former U.S. President Barack Obama is the latest to condemn the response. In a leaked call with the Biden campaign, he called the government's actions, quote, an absolute chaotic disaster, blaming U.S. President Donald Trump's approach to governing. In response, the White House called Trump's decisions unprecedented and that many lives have been saved. For a closer look, we're joined by Aaron Blake, who's a senior political writer of The Washington Post, and we reached him in Washington. Aaron, always great to have you on the show. Lots to talk about. What do we make of the news that Anthony Fauci and 2 other members of the White House coronavirus task force, including the head of the CDC, are in self-isolation? What do you make of that?
Well, certainly there was probably only a matter of time before this virus got inside the White House to some degree. We've seen it now with a couple cases in recent days. I think what's interesting about what's happening with Fauci and with the other medical experts that are on the White House coronavirus task force is that Fauci a couple months ago indicated that he was pushing for stronger precautions inside the White House. He said, for instance, that they should be holding White House briefings on the coronavirus virtually rather than in person. This was at a time when they were still packing media inside these briefings, and there was, 5 or 6 people on the task force standing shoulder to shoulder on the stage. So, the fact that he's now dealing with this in a way that many Americans are, I think, is telling, but it's also telling about what's going on in the White House, which is that for however much they've been telling people to follow the federal guidelines, there has been kind of a very cavalier attitude towards things like wearing masks, towards, stopping having public events and things like that. And now Dr. Fauci, who has been kind of a contrary voice in many ways on some of these things, is dealing with the consequences of that potentially.
There have been questions raised as well at the daily briefings by the media about the fact that the president, the vice president, very close proximity, no masks being worn, of course, and so you have the commander-in-chief and his replacement right next to each other. What are the potential concerns should either or both of those men become sick?
Well, the White House's response to this is that members of the White House who are in close proximity to the president are being regularly tested. At the same time, the president himself has acknowledged that frequent testing isn't necessarily a cure-all here. The White House has one of the best testing regimes of anywhere in the country. They have an in-house and very a quick method of doing this, so they can, if there are people who come into the White House who are infected, they can spot that very quickly. But to some degree, the question here is not just about testing, but about precautions that are being taken. And when the president goes to a mask factory and doesn't wear a mask, when the vice president goes to the Mayo Clinic, one of the top hospitals in the country, and doesn't wear a mask despite everybody around him wearing a mask, I think that sends a signal, not just because of what might happen within the White House, but also with this kind of growing nascent movement in the United States to flout these federal guidelines and argue that they're overkill in some way.
This crisis, of course, has been unlike any other, but so too are the comments that we saw from the former president. Usually, protocol has it, they don't overtly criticize a sitting president. Let's talk about the politicization of this and going forward, how this might play out on the political landscape by both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, one thing is that you're exactly right that former presidents basically stay out of things whenever possible. President Obama has very gently treated Donald Trump during his presidency. He's even talked publicly about how he doesn't think it's healthy for former presidents to be speaking out about these things. I thought it was really telling from his comments that he didn't just question the response to coronavirus, but he also brought up what happened on Friday, which is that the Justice Department dropped the case against former Trump advisor Michael Flynn, which also caused a lot of controversy in this country. I don't know what the circumstances of this reporting leaking out were, but it seems like a moment in which President Obama saw fit to speak up in certain ways, at least privately, perhaps knowing that maybe it would leak out because he feels like these are some very important issues. Whether that will have any impact politically on the president or on the response, I think is very much to be determined. The president certainly doesn't have a whole lot of regard for former President Obama, and I think that the president's supporters will certainly chalk this up to some degree to partisanship.
In that vein, how might that be either addressed or used by the president and his allies?
Well, the president has loved to talk about Barack Obama even long into his presidency, just like he loves to keep talking about Hillary Clinton. I don't know how much he intends to talk about this. I think a lot of it depends on whether President Obama decides to keep talking about this in certain ways. But certainly that's something that can't be ruled out, given that, the president even just this morning was talking about how President Obama's response to the swine flu back in 2009 was a disaster and had really bad poll numbers. Those things aren't true, but I think it shows that he is anxious to punish those who speak out against him in certain ways.
And so it goes. Aaron, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Aaron Blake is a senior political writer for The Washington Post.